Hi, Wendy Rodrigue here. I am standing here at the Lod Cook Alumni Center, which is the Alumni Center at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We are spotlighting today George Rodrigue's magnificent portrait of President Ronald Reagan, a painting from 1986 that has hung here at the Alumni Center since 2004. A spectacular piece of Americana, an important American modernist portrait. So how did we get here? Well, let's go back in time a bit. At this time in George's career in the mid-1980s, he was not as well known, well, I take that back, he was well known in Louisiana, but mostly for his festival portraits. However, outside of the state of Louisiana, throughout the country and even beyond the country, he was very well known for his Cajun paintings, interestingly enough, even in areas where people didn't really know Cajun. And one of the ways that that happened, and that this happened, was that in 1976, George Rodrigue's book, The Cajuns of George Rodrigue, was published by Oxmoor House in Birmingham, Alabama. That book is the first national publication ever on the Cajun culture. It is also the first bilingual book of any type ever published in the United States. The National Endowment for the Arts picked up on that. They loved the book so much that they showed it to First Lady Rosalynn Carter, who then shared it with her husband, President Carter, and together they chose it as an official gift of state for the Carter White House. Quite an honor, and that is what first brought George Rodrigue to the attention of that crowd. So fast forward a bit, and a man named Henson Moore, who was the Deputy Secretary of Energy under President Reagan and was an alumnus of LSU, right here where we're standing, approached the Republican Party and suggested that they approach George Rodrigue for a portrait of President Ronald Reagan. And that is indeed what happened. Now, this is not the official portrait. Official portraits, certainly at that time, were very formal. Instead, they wanted a more casual portrait of President Reagan that maybe reflected more of his personality and reflected more of who we knew him to be. So the result of that, because it was a more casual portrait, was that George could do anything he wanted. So he comes up with this design and this idea that he wants to paint President Reagan as an American hero. Why? Well, he was, right, a cowboy. That's a real American, a cowboy, and a rancher, and of course a movie star. And here he is in his white hat, on his white horse as a hero, and then the governor of California, and of course the ultimate hero, right, the President of the United States, an American hero. George proposes this idea. The Republican Party was very excited about it, and they arranged for him to photograph President Reagan at his ranch in Simi Valley. George flies out to California and is at the ranch, and he always laughed and was surprised. He said that when he got there, there were actually 200 photographers, this is the way he described it, standing there hanging over the fence, waiting for President and Mrs. Reagan to come around on their horse. Well, sure enough, here they came, and everybody's jockeying for position to get just the right photograph, including young George. And he gets there and he said, the way George used to describe it is that President Reagan came out on this horse whose head was bowed so low. George used to say it looked like an old mule, he said, is how it came out. And he was like, this'll never do. It doesn't look presidential at all, or like the big hero, but nevertheless he's there, and so he photographs President Reagan and Nancy Reagan, as a matter of fact. And of course, I always like to remind my young artists that this was in the days of film. There was no digital photography, so George came home with about 12, 15 photographs. He develops them. He is very disappointed because this is not what he wants at all. He actually had slides. I should take that back, not photographs. And so George, being George, because he is very clever in all things, as I go over in these films oftentimes, he comes up with an idea. George has always been a big cowboy fan, and so he flips through his cowboy books, and he finds this great photo of Gene Autry on his horse Champion, and he put Reagan's head on him. So how did he create this painting? Well, he actually would have photographed, made a slide of that page in the book of Jean Autry Champion. Then he would have projected it using an overhead projector onto this canvas, a blank canvas. Then he would have done a loose outline around Jean Autry and the horse so that he could place him just where he wanted, right? Then he would pull the overhead projector away, and then the fun really begins. What he's going to do is actually shape the design of the painting around President Reagan and the horse so that they are not touching the sky, so that they are, in this case, locked into America. So I hope you can see that even the horse's head, as you can see, is framed by those bushes there, and Reagan is very much defined by this frame of the tree. He is locked in just as George painted his Cajuns. Most of you may know that George, for the first 3 years of his painting career, painted nothing but oak tree, ground, and sky. And what he did that really changed American landscape painting was he changed it from a very European style of big skies to cutting his tree off at the top, as it is here, so that the light would shine from underneath the branches and be smaller sky in the distance, a smaller light sky. And you would also have these interesting shapes, which you can see some of those here too in the branches. And also by cutting the tree off at the top, it is as though all of us looking at this painting are actually under that tree and can enter this painting and greet our American hero. So George did that often with the Cajuns, and the way he developed this particular figure style is that he said he wondered one day, what would a person look like who walked out from behind one of my trees? And he thought, well, they'd have to be very primitive because they're outside. And he also thought of them as floating and ghost-like. Now, when he developed this, he was thinking about the Cajuns. Obviously, President Reagan was not Cajun, but the same thing applies here. He was thinking of the Cajuns as timeless in his paintings as 1780 or 1880, for example. And he was really thinking about the expulsion from Canada during Le Grand Retranchement in 1755, which he described as the Cajuns literally being cut out of Canada and pasted onto South Louisiana. George has done that here with President Reagan. It is as though he has cut out and pasted onto this American, very strong American landscape. George used to say that in terms of how his paintings are constructed, his paintings are primarily about contrasts. We see a lot of that here. The hard edges of the tree, for example, contrasting with the very impressionistic backgrounds, and obviously very strong contrasts of light and dark also. So here, instead of Cajuns, we have this very strong, glowing white horse. George would paint his Cajun people all in white, which is a no-no, right? Beneath a tree when you're in shadow. No, George said, and that's because his figures, again, began with the Cajuns, that extended here to an American hero, our American hero, as George titled it. It applies the same, and that is they're not lit by the sunlight, they are lit by an inner light and glow from the inside out, just as really this horse does, as well as President Reagan on top of it. Pretty fabulous. So what else do we have in this painting? Above we have the eagle. Well, I think this is pretty tremendous because at the time that George was working on this, he was working on another exhibition and during this same year, actually in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was a show that opened. It was hosted by a friend of his named Rosalie Murphy. If any of you have been to Santa Fe, she founded the Pink Adobe Restaurant and Bar many decades ago now. And she was a big fan of George's and a big friend of George's, also of Douglas's, who is filming this for us right now. And she was such a fan of his work that she asked George if she could please host an exhibition for him for the Santa Fe community and kind of introduce him to the Santa Fe art scene in the apartment above the Pink Adobe. And she did just that. We still have the invitation today. So for that, George was painting very much Southwest type scenes, scenes of Native Americans, scenes of the desert, of the Spanish people. It was a really wonderful, wonderful exhibition, and one that we will recreate and do somewhere down the line. My point is, he's got that on his mind, and in fact, he's working on that while he's doing this. So, and we'll pick up on that again in just a few minutes. So in this particular piece, he puts the American eagle and he spreads its wings across the top of this oak tree. Beneath it, he's got both the arrows and the fig leaf. The eagle, of course, as it does traditionally, looking towards the leaves, because it's peace, right? We are willing to go to war for peace, but we prefer peace. Yeah, magnificent. So then what happens with this painting? Well, this painting, indeed, I was mentioning George was working on those pieces for Santa Fe. That is where it premiered. Hello, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because George finished it just about the time that his show was opening there. So he brought it with him. A lot of people don't realize that George went to Santa Fe regularly. For one thing, he made all of his bronzes there at a place called Shidoni Foundry in Tusuke, just outside of Santa Fe, including his bronzes of Evangeline and Gabriel and Longfellow and the little Cajun fisherman. That's where he made them. And we went there for years. But the main reason he liked going there is because he had many wonderful artist friends there. Some of his dearest artist friends. George used to say that in Louisiana, it just didn't work as much for him that way because, well, I think it's a hometown sort of situation, right? And when he got to Santa Fe, there was a lot more camaraderie for him when it came to artist friends. So he enjoyed bringing whatever he was working on whenever he went to Santa Fe and sharing with them, and he enjoyed seeing what they were working on. So this time, in addition to his whole show, he brought Reagan, with President Reagan, our American hero, which premiered in Santa Fe, New Mexico with that exhibition. Afterwards, George brought the painting back because it was time for the real unveiling, which would be with President Reagan. The painting was unveiled 2 different times. The first time was right here in Baton Rouge, also in 1986, with President Reagan, of course, and Henson Moore, and presumably also Lod Cook. I'm sure they were all there. It was a very big deal. And then afterwards, a few months later, it was unveiled again in New Orleans with Patrick F. Taylor, the businessman. And Pat Taylor was also an LSU alum and also a really big supporter of President Ronald Reagan. So we have all of those photographs. They're quite amazing. And when it was unveiled in New Orleans, the story that George loved to tell was that he was in the audience and he's watching all this and everybody leaves and he thinks they're all gone and the painting is still up on the stage, and George says, they forgot the painting. So he goes on the stage and he takes it and he puts it in his blue van. Some of you who've known him might remember that blue van. And he brings it to his friend's house where he's having dinner. And as he's walking in the door, the phone is ringing, and it was the Secret Service. Somehow they tracked him down. George always found that to be a mystery. And they said, Mr. Rodrigue, you have the painting? Yes. So George jumps in 5 o'clock traffic in New Orleans and races to the airport, the New Orleans airport, and they have held the gates open for George to actually drive his van onto the tarmac and up to the stairs of Air Force One, where the Secret Service and President Reagan are waiting and holding the plane for this painting. So off the painting goes to Washington, D.C. to hang in the White House. Well, then, fast forward about a year and a half or so, and we're in 1988, and it is time for the summit in Moscow. John Folse, Chef John Folse, I know many of you know them. He and George were very close, particularly in those days. And he decided to do a Louisiana delegation, get a whole delegation, cultural delegation together of food, music, and art, and present it to the Russian people during the Moscow summit of 1988. Big thing to put together. George is bringing 12 paintings to do this. One is this portrait right here. This painting did go to Moscow. He borrowed it back from President Reagan. And then he borrowed 10 paintings, 10 of his most prized paintings that were already owned by other collectors. These are all Cajun type scenes. And then he paints an additional painting to bring with him, and that was a portrait this exact size, really a companion portrait of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. So he brings this painting of Mikhail Gorbachev and the Reagan and these other 10 paintings to Moscow. The first day that they're there, George sets up his show there at the International Hotel in Moscow, and also the Sovereign, what do they call it? The Sovereign Center World Trade Center, which I guess was attached to the hotel, is the way I recall it from him. He sets the pieces up and the KGB comes in, and they had a few comments. The first comment was they wanted to know why Mikhail Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, was standing on the ground and with his hand extended, and why there was a peasant family behind him, because they said he looked like he was begging. And you can see that painting online, and I'll also post pictures of it. Would love to see it in an exhibition soon, and I think we can make that happen. So they wanted to know why he was doing that. Why was he begging? And George said, he's not begging. I was using his own phraseology, his own description of himself as a man of the people. They weren't convinced. The second thing they said is they wanted to know, why was President Reagan on a horse when their President Gorbachev was not on a horse? And George said, I didn't know that Gorbachev had a horse. And they said, he didn't. We were hoping that President Reagan would give him a horse. That's the way George told it to me. That was the next thing. And then finally, they said, we would like for you to give this painting to President Gorbachev. And George agreed. He said that he would do that, provided that he could present the painting to President Gorbachev in person and have his picture taken. They would not agree to that, and so George would not agree to give them the painting. George always said that the fourth hiccup, he was always very glad that they didn't notice, which was that George had shaped Gorbachev's very famous birthmark on his forehead loosely like a crawfish. Ha ha! So George goes to bed that night. Again, this is the first day of the exhibition. The next day he gets up, and to his shock, he goes into the exhibition, and all the news people, remember it's the summit, so I mean the world news people are there. And not the Russian people, by the way. George said that was a big thing. They weren't even allowed in there. This whole show ended up being for the news. And the politicians. And so they're all in there, and they're looking, and the chefs and the musicians, and including, by the way, Chef Jubins was at Jubins the other night. It was so fabulous. He was on that trip. I think there were about a dozen Louisiana chefs. Anyway, they're all standing there, and they're looking at George going, do you have your paintings? The paintings were gone. They were not there. They were missing and remained missing for 3 full days. No explanation. No one knew where they were. Again, all the world press is there. Immediately, the articles start coming out. Immediately, the TV. The coverage was huge. In fact, that was the #1 AP story for 3 days in May of 1988. And I wrote down a couple of these headlines for you because, I mean, I just picked a few. They were so great, but quickly. From the AP, Soviets Lasso Artwork. Officials seize painting of president as cowboy. LA Times, painting of Reagan corralled by Soviet authorities. New Art Examiner, Kremlin nixes Cajun painter's Gorby portrait. Times-Picayune, rebel Cajun painter. Times-Picayune again, Soviet picture problem has Louisiana artist seeing red. And my personal favorite, LA Times, Cajun artist has spicy words for the Soviets. 3 days go by, no paintings. Can you imagine the panic that George is in? He only owns one of the paintings in the entire collection. That would be the painting of Gorbachev. There are 10 paintings already owned by private collectors, and another one that is owned by the President of the United States himself. Giant problem. On the 3rd day, or might have been the 4th day, George walks in with everyone else in the morning, and all the paintings have been returned. No explanation, No, nothing. George said that the Soviets were so embarrassed, the KGB was so embarrassed about what had happened that they returned the paintings. They were taking them and had planned on, he suspects, holding them ransom for George to give them the Gorbachev painting. So that day, they make another pitch for him to give President Gorbachev the painting. They again would not meet his request of a picture and to meet Gorbachev in person, and so he said no. And so they issued him new transport papers. And George's new papers stated that he could leave the country, but not with any artwork. Real panic. So that night, in the middle of the night, George asked some of his news friends with ABC News if they would help him. They snuck there into the World Trade Center, and they took all of the paintings off of out of their frames, off of their stretchers. They rolled them, and they disguised them by rolling on the outside tourist posters from Moscow there. And then they put them in big tubes, and ABC News had traveled with a big, what they called their big beer cooler, and they put all of them in that beer cooler and put the cooler on Air Force Two. In those days, the press did not have to go through customs. That's how the paintings got back. And George met the paintings in Washington, D.C., and of course everybody was talking about this, and as a result of the whole thing, Representative Bob Livingston, U.S. Representative from here in Louisiana, hosted a one-day show, one evening big reception for George on Capitol Hill with all of the paintings for everyone to see what caused all of the hoopla. Wow! So the painting goes back to the Reagan painting. All the paintings go back to everyone that owns them. The Reagan painting goes back to the White House. It hung in the White House all the way throughout the rest of Reagan's presidency. And then after his presidency, it hung in the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. And then at his death in 2004, Nancy Reagan donated the painting to the Lod Cook Alumni Center here in honor of the Reagans, one of their dearest friends, Mr. Lod Cook, the LSU alum who built this alumni center, and who was also, in particular, a very close friend of Mrs. Reagan's, especially during President Reagan's illness late in life. So it's very meaningful. So a true Louisiana treasure coming back here to LSU because of Nancy Reagan's foresight and real generosity. So then what happens? Well, this is where it has been hanging ever since, except a few times. It was borrowed, for example, by Governor Jindal to hang at his desk while he was president here. We also borrowed it in 2006 for the exhibition in Memphis at the Dixon Gallery and Gardens Museum. And then in 2007, it hung most famously in the New Orleans Museum of Art for a retrospective of George Rodrigue paintings. Some of you may remember that, over 250 works. It was amazing. Now in that exhibition, John Bullard, who was the director at the time, he is now the director emeritus, and by the way, the longest running museum director in the US ever. He said, we can't have a Rodrigue retrospective without having a portrait show. And George said, I'm not a portrait artist. He always said that. He always said that. And so I was with George the day that he walked in and saw the show for the first time. It hadn't yet opened. They were still finishing last minute touches in the install. And it was just the two of us. We were taking a walk through. And here we came to the big room and it said portraits, and we walked in and there was, Paul Prudhomme and Huey Long and, oh my gosh, so many, Drew Brees and the Romero brothers and, well, many of them. It ended up being the largest part of the whole show. And he walked up to this painting and he looked at it and he said, well, I guess I am a portrait artist after all. Thank you to the Lod Cook Alumni Center for allowing us to film here today. They have always been generous with loaning this painting for us to use. I'm really grateful to them. I know there will be exhibitions in the future where we hope they'll be willing to part with it for a bit. Really thrilled to be able to make this film. Thank you, Douglas, for filming. Thank you, George.